Velkommen til endnu et afsnit af Studerende i Biblioteket. Jeg hedder Gustav.
Og mit navn er Erik.
Og vi er 2 psykologistuderende. Nej, ikke mere studerende.
For nogens vedkommende.
Som laver den her podcast, Studerende i Biblioteket, hvor vi diskuterer psykologi og filosofi.
Ja, og vi har været så heldige, at dette afsnit, det er ikke bare os 2, der går ud af en eller anden tangent sammen, selvom det også er meget hyggeligt, men vi faktisk har fået besøg af Dr. Thomas Fuchs,
som er professor i psykiatri og filosofi ved Universitetet i Heidelberg, hvor der engang sad en fyr, der hed Karl Jaspers, som er sådan en eksistenstænker, der kombinerede de her 2 felter. Og Fuchs er også, har den specielle titel, at han er Karl Jaspers professor i psykiatri og filosofi. Så det bygger lidt videre på vores sidste par afsnit, hvor vi har drøftet kroppen og følelser og psykopatologi, og hvordan alt det hænger sammen i sådan en mere fænomenologisk ramme.
Ja, og Thomas Fuchs, han arbejder inden for ligesom både det fænomenologiske, det psykopatologiske, kliniske og kognitiv neuroscience. Så han er en stemme, som der generelt er bredt funderet og kommer med et take på krop-psyke-problemet her, og hvordan man tilgår det.
Og i interviewet kommer vi kommer rimelig bredt omkring. Altså det overordnede spørgsmål er jo, hvad et fænomenologisk perspektiv kan tilbyde psykiatrien, hvilke blindpunkter den ligesom kan supplere med, for at få en bedre forståelse af, hvordan vi hindrer forskellige psykiske lidelser.
Og så kommer vi ind på, hvad hans forståelse af psykiatriens formål er. Vi kommer lidt ind på det her embodied affectivity begreb, som vi allerede har vendt, hvor han ligesom kommer med sit bud.
Så spørger vi ham om, hvad han mener, at filosofien kan tilbyde videnskabelige discipliner som psykiatri og psykologi.
Og til sidst kommer vi lidt ind på, hvad er fremtiden for psykiatrien, og hvordan arbejder vi videre for at få en bedre psykiatri.
Så ja, vi bevæger os både i det teoretiske og det mere praktiske. Og det er jo også noget af det allerfedeste, når man kan vise, hvordan en eller anden meget abstrakt idé ligesom kan komme til udtryk i en eller anden praksis, som bedre kan hjælpe os med at forstå og hindre psykiske lidelser på forskellige måder. Nu laver vi jo ikke så meget promovering, mig, Erik. Det er måske lidt vores svage side, men hvis du på nogen måde får noget ud af det, som du hører med Fuchs eller andre ting, så husk at fortælle en nørdet filosofi-interesseret ven om det. Spred ordet.
Eller en, der bare gerne vil have gode karakterer til eksamen.
Så de forhåbninger Fuchs har for psykiatrien, så der kan komme lidt gang i den bølge, for eksempel. Og man kan jo også rate Studerende i Biblioteket, Spotify, Apple Music, alt sådan noget. Hvis
vi håber i hvert fald, I nyder podcast rigtig meget. Vi nød i hvert fald at tale med Thomas Fuchs, der var så sød og give os en time af hans tid. Og vi håber, I får lige så meget ud af det, som vi gør.
Welcome to you, Thomas Fuchs, to the podcast. Thanks so much for wanting to do this. We've been looking very much forward to talking to you.
Yeah. If you didn't know it, we've already had one of your texts on the podcast where we tried to see if we could lay out what we thought that you meant in this paper, the embodiment paper on moving and being moved. And now we have you to actually find out what is the key things to take away from this text. So we are very, very excited to see you.
But yeah, maybe.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know that, so you're already acquainted with a bit of our work here. So it's on embodiment and affectivity in particular, emotions. So.
But yeah, okay. Maybe for any listeners who don't know about your work, if you could introduce yourself and which kind of questions you are interested in.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I'm situated in Heidelberg, which is a university and a psychiatric clinic with a certain phenomenological, anthropological tradition. That's also the reason why I'm here, and I've been appointed what has been called Karl Jaspers Professor for Philosophy and Psychiatry, so for the philosophical foundations of psychiatry and psychotherapy. And this points out that my work is kind of interlinking or connecting clinical work, psychiatric, psychopathological research, and philosophical foundations. So the core of all that is, of course, phenomenology, which bridges psychopathology and philosophy, and which is particularly suitable to describe and to analyze disturbed experiences of our patients. And that is the major topic of my research and my work and my teaching over the last 20 years. And I may add that this is particularly centered around the topic of embodiment, which combines a view on the lived body that as we experience it with a view on the living organism as a systemic whole, so that we have a double aspect view on the human person, once on the one hand as an experiencing person, erlebende Person in German, and on the other hand as a living person, liebende Person, which is the organism and its interaction with the environment. I already delved into the matter of our research, but perhaps you have more general questions first, so I don't want to go on just like that. Perhaps we keep on interacting.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. So you have this special view on the psychiatry, and we would like to ask for you, what is the general psychiatry, and what is it trying to achieve, and what's the state of it today?
Well, that's of course a very general and in a sense also difficult question, because psychiatry is and has always been a very multifaceted and kind of self-contradictory undertaking. So the discipline has many aspects, has many approaches, and it's very difficult to say what psychiatry actually is. But of course, the core of psychiatry is or should be the suffering of mentally ill patients, or suffering of patients with certain kinds of psychic disturbances. And psychiatry should be the discipline that first diagnoses and understands these disturbances on the background of a clear notion of subjectivity, of a clear philosophical understanding of the many dimensions of subjectivity and their possible disturbances, because that's the only way to really bridge the gap that has arisen through a mental disturbance. So patients want to be understood, basically. Then we have to integrate these primary understanding into a nosology of mental disorders, and then, of course, we have to look for the adequate treatment, which in psychiatry always has been a combination of biological, psychotherapeutic, and very important social or socio-therapeutic, so social psychiatric approaches, famously united in the so-called biopsychosocial model of mental disorders, which is a kind of altogether term, putting everything in one box, but it's not quite clear how all this is related to each other. And therefore, psychiatry is a very difficult and, in a sense, in a not very homogeneous discipline.
I'm very curious about what you think about like more the practice side of psychiatry, like in the modern Western world. Do you view it positively or with skepticism, or like what do you think about how psychiatry is practiced out in the hospitals, like in Germany or Denmark or similar countries?
Well, compared to the state of psychiatry, let's say 50 years ago, I think the treatment of patients has made enormous progress. Not only on the, not only on the biological side, where we have drugs and treatments that were alien to psychiatry until 1950. So we have at least a number of efficient biological therapies in the meantime. But even more important, psychiatry has changed quite a lot since the 1970s and has turned into a discipline which doesn't just put patients into asylums, but treats and interacts with patients in their original environments. So sees the patient as integrated as part of a kind of ecological environment, an ecological system that is important to keep in mind and is important to integrate into the treatment. And these approaches have become more and more important over the last decades and have turned psychiatry into a more social, ecological discipline. This is a bit an optimistic view, I admit, because at the same time, in the university departments of psychiatry, there has been a strong shift towards a mainly brain-centered and biological psychiatry, which is in part divergent from the general tendency of psychiatry in the main hospitals and in the rural hospitals to integrate a social psychiatric approach. So we have a kind of dichotomy here between the cutting-edge research of the biologically oriented university departments with a mainly reductionist approach, unfortunately, and a more general tendency of psychiatry to include, for example, families, relatives into treatment. There are the so-called trialogue approaches, which include relatives and families into the dialogue between psychiatrists and patients. So this is a positive development. But as I said, psychiatry cannot be understood in one dimension only. It's a multifaceted development, but at least to give an overall view of the current situation.
And you enter this field with your research, for example, on embodiment, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the embodied affectivity and how it applies to psychiatry.
Well, this refers to the term embodiment, which I briefly explained some minutes ago. So the main idea is that with the term embodiment, we cover a complementary view on the human person as both experiencing subjective and intersubjectively oriented person, and a view on the organism as a whole, which differs deeply from a merely brain-centered view of the human psyche. So this is the basic layout of the notion of embodiment as a complementary notion. Now, in affectivity and in emotions, we can see this double aspect very well because emotions are not to be located in a kind of inner sphere of the psyche, as it was, for example, the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approach to see emotions as some kind of inner inner happenings in the organism. So they cannot be seen as enclosed in the psyche. They can neither be seen as enclosed in the brain, but emotions are, as we experience it, relations of the living being, of the lived body to the environment. So emotions are overarching phenomena that integrate the current situation with its various affective qualities, and the lived body with its particular reactions and resonance towards these affective qualities, and the person as an active agent that is motivated by emotions. And by motivation, we already have the word motion included in the concept. And motion means that the person reacts and moves, motivated by emotions towards the environment. So when we take all this together, we see that emotions cannot be located somewhere in the person, but they are integrative phenomena that link the situation the person sees herself in with the lived body and the interaction of the lived body with the environment. This runs down to a circular idea of what emotions are. Circular interaction between the situation that affects me and the lived body that is affected and resonates with the situation, and the tendency to react and to act on the situation, which is a kind of movement tendency. So if we take all this together, it's clear that emotions are overarching, comprehensive phenomena, and in that sense, they are a nice example of how we conceive of basic psychic phenomena, namely not as something inside, not as something brain produced, but as a continuous relation and interaction of the living organism with its environment.
So maybe instead of the more linear causality in maybe the James Lange model where you have some process that leads to another process that leads to an emotion, it sounds like more an emergent phenomena.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you could call it an emergent phenomena because the emotion or the affect, however you want to name it, and the emotion is the integral phenomenon that arises from this continuous circular loop that I've described, and cannot be reduced to one of the components, so to speak. So that would be an emergent phenomenon, very well put. And in this sense, it's something that we have to see in as a process, a process that cannot be taken just cross-sectionally and that cannot be located.
Yeah, but what would happen if, or what is the consequence of trying to reduce emotions in different kind of ways, methodologically, as is usually done?
That we lose the phenomenon itself, that we focus on one component only. Usually that is done in cognitivist approaches that see emotions as a kind of as a kind of cognitive process that interprets the situation and is based on a belief desire structure where the body doesn't play a major role, where also the action tendencies do not play a role, and emotion is thus conceived as a kind of cognitive event that may be regarded without the living body and without the continuous interaction that emotion already induces. So in this sense, we have a certain component that is isolated and detached from the holistic loop that in which emotions consist. And this may be sometimes an advantage for empirical research, because then the methodology may focus on a certain isolated event and explore this isolated event in more and more detail. But the decisive mistake happens then when this isolated component is seen or regarded as the emotion itself, and not integrated again into the holistic loop. So research that focuses on micro components, whatever, cognitive components or brain areas, such a research is fine as long as it integrates its results into the holistic view. But that is normally missed, and therefore we arrive at a reductive notion, which is precisely not adequate and not suitable to take the whole person into account who experiences the emotion.
More on the theoretical side, I was curious, what are your more, which kinds of theories from phenomenology do you draw on the most? Like, are you more interested in kind of the Merleau-Ponty embodied side of it, or also like Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, or who are like your philosophical inspirations?
Well, phenomenology is a now 100 years old tradition, or over 100 years old tradition, that has many strands and many schools, so to speak. So it's always a kind of personal inclination that leads you to favor certain traditions, certain authors, and to perhaps neglect others. In the meantime, it's not possible to have a complete overview on the whole field, but certainly you would always start with Husserl's introduction of phenomenology into the philosophical and scientific field, because all other authors mainly refer to his crucial insights into the structures of subjectivity. But then, of course, an embodied approach would strongly rely on authors such as Merleau-Ponty, but also in Germany there's Hermann Schmitz, who is an important representative of a body-oriented phenomenology, not very well known outside of Germany, but he has created a very in-depth vocabulary and analysis of what we feel interoceptively as living bodies, or as the lived bodies we are. So that is a part of a body-oriented phenomenology, which is not found in Merleau-Ponty to that extent. So to describe the movements, the dynamics of interoception of the inner bodily experience, which is at the core of all our experience. So all experience resonates and is centered in a certain sense in these dynamics of our bodily interoception. And we see that more and more as important for mental illness as well, where interoception plays an increasingly important role. This dynamics of the inner body has been very well described by Hermann Schmitz, a German phenomenologist who's less known outside of Germany. So that would be at least two crucial authors for body phenomenology, but there are, of course, others which relate more to the psychopathological field. Erwin Strauss, for example, is still a major figure for my approach.
And what in general do you think about the relationship between philosophy on the one hand and like science or psychiatry or psychology on the other. I feel like that's a topic, at least at our university, that's discussed a lot, like what the relationship between those two should be.
Between philosophy and psychiatry or psychology. Well, as Jaspers put it, a psychiatry which would not be aware of its philosophical dimension would be very blind would be blind to the very structure and very phenomenal the phenomenal quality of the experiences that it deals with. Psychiatry deals with the experience of patients, and this experience is to a high degree divergent from our usual experiences. Therefore, we need a very good philosophical approach to understand the basic structures of experience and how they can become disturbed. So, for example, what a hallucination is can only be understood and explained when we have a very good concept of what perception is. Is hallucination just a distorted perception? Is it a kind of experience that overlays our relation to the environment, that exaggerates a certain endogenous component of our perception? Perception can be conceived as a kind of composition between external relations that we have to the environment and our own inner schemas and inner expectations about the environment. And these two have to come together to create perception. Now we can understand hallucination in this composition as a kind of exaggerated inner production of schemas. But as I explained this very, very briefly, you can already see that without a notion of what perception is, we can never understand what hallucinations should be. And this notion of perception is, of course, something that we need to describe philosophically first, because on the just psychological, today mainly cognitivist level, we only we only deal with certain components, with certain micro mechanisms, and we never reach the level of what perception is per se. And that applies to all other dimensions of mental disorders, be they spatial, temporal deviations or alterations, intersubjective alterations of intersubjective perception, alterations of affectivity, alterations, of course, of embodiment of the lived body. In all these cases, we need a philosophical framework that lets us understand, that enables us to understand the derailments, so to speak, the alterations of normal constitutive processes that underlie our experience. On the other hand, philosophy and psychiatry are linked through knowledge theoretical approaches. So there's the theory of science that is necessary for psychiatry as for all other empirical disciplines that enables us to understand the basic notions of psychiatry, such as what is mental illness, what is normal, what is abnormal, what is delusion. So all these notions that we use in psychiatry have a theoretical level, a scientific theoretical level, where philosophy acts as a theoretical discipline, clarifying the notions and the terminology that we use. So again, another necessary philosophical influence, that another necessary philosophical impact on psychiatry. As you see, there are a number of. Then we can talk about the notion of causality. What is causality in the mental sphere? How do we understand motivation? How do we understand the role of the brain for mental disorders or for mental experience in general? Again, we have a philosophical question relating to the mind-body problem. Impossible for psychiatry to address without a philosophical approach. I think that's enough to show that we need philosophy in psychiatry. And well, the same would apply ceteris paribus for psychology, of course.
I guess also what you're talking about when you talk about the complexity of the phenomena and that they are hard to understand, I guess that it could tie together with the history of psychiatry, where you said before we put people in asylums or took them out of the city to try to treat them because we had no understanding what these complex heterogeneous phenomena even was. But yeah, so I guess philosophy can try to clarify what we're actually working with.
Yes. Although I wouldn't deny that there were some understandable reasons for the original take of psychiatry, or the original approach of psychiatry towards mental disorders, namely to free patients from the disturbing influences of their immediate environment, to let them recover in a certain peaceful environment in the rural countryside. And that was the original idea, which was not completely irrational, of course, or not completely suppressive, so to speak, as it is often seen, that psychiatry was a kind of suppressive political discipline. I think that is not true, but of course you're completely right. We understand mental disorders much better in the meantime as disturbances of interaction that can be changed through helping the patient deal with his ecological situation in different ways, to change his behavior in a more adaptive and more functional way, and that is best done within this environment and not somewhere else or outside. So that is a different approach today, which is also based and influenced by an ecological philosophy and ecological approach to psychology. You're right.
But even today we have the same problem that many of the diseases or the causes of suffering we don't fully know yet, I guess, like you do in medicine, for example. So we have these clinicians who try to relieve people of suffering of something that is very difficult to understand. So maybe with some of your research, how can more embodied focused therapies or approaches help relieve suffering today?
Yes, an embodied approach would, of course, also change our approach to therapy in significant ways. As you well know, most biological approaches regard mental disorders as something that can be located and that can be traced back to certain dysfunctions in circumscribed brain areas that could then be treated through either pharmacological or psychostimulant means, such as transmagnetic brain stimulation and other immediate actions on the brain. An embodied approach would regard mental disorders as disturbances of the interactive loops that run through the brain, of course, but through the whole living body, and of course through the environment with its particularly social interactions. So it would regard mental illness as a much more complex deviation and dysfunction of a continuous ongoing interactive loop. That leads to a much more body-centered take on psychotherapy, on therapy in general, which would mean that all changes that we can bring about in the experience of the body, in the movement of the body, in the actions of the body, are in the core of such an approach. So we would include much more body-oriented therapies, movement-oriented therapies, therapies that are focused on resonant experience of the body, such as in music therapy, for example, but also art therapy. And it would include the interactions of the lived body with the lived body of others. So it would focus much more on what is going on in psychotherapy on a bodily level, and would focus or would try to induce the patient's awareness of his own embodied feelings, to stay with what he feels within the body in order to understand better how he is related to the current situation. In this paper, which you mentioned, we took the example of so-called alexithymic disorders. These are patients which have, alexithymia means they cannot understand their feelings because the bodily resonance of their feelings is not related to the holistic understanding of the situation. They feel something towards the situation, but they have no awareness of how of what the meaning of this felt bodily changes is. So in this sense, they have a bodily change, which often leads to somatoform symptoms and somatoform disorders, because they cannot relate their bodily resonance to the current situation. And in this example, you see that understanding oneself and being aware of one's bodily reactions in the meaningful relation to the current situation is a very important means of therapy, of psychotherapy, and is also a very important preventive approach, because the more patients are able to understand their bodily reactions, to be aware of them, to be mindful, for example, to take another approach, and that is currently very important. So mindfulness approaches towards your own bodily experience can help you to deal better with current situations and problematic situations in your environment, and in this sense have a preventive effect with regard to possible future mental disorders or dysfunctions. So focusing on the lived body through various therapies that I've briefly mentioned, and of course through the awareness that the patient can increase of his lived body, brings a new element, a new component into the whole cycles of loops in which mental disorders consist. Doesn't just focus on a located brain area, but sees the lived body as the medium, so as the component that mediates between the person and her environment in all ways. And in this sense can lead to a much more a shift in the focus of therapy on therapies that focus on the lived body, on bodily experience, on present experience, on subjective feelings, bodily sensations, and in this sense create a much more holistic approach to mental disorders and their therapy.
And I think you mentioned resonance, and just to our listeners who didn't listen to the one where we walked through the paper, so I guess you paint this picture that you're kind of in tune with the world or with the situation, like a music instrument, that there should be a connection through this resonance that can be out of tune. Maybe you can supply a little bit of this. Yeah,
that's I think a very nice picture, which is of course suggested by the term resonance. That the body, as William James put it, acts as a resonant organ, as a sounding board in which all emotions reverberate, as he puts it. But we need, of course, to see this sounding board as attuned to the environment and to the repeated and recurrent situation that the patient or that we are all faced with, and seeing the body as a kind of attuned instrument suggests the idea that that the therapy consists in a kind of reattunement, Umstimmung, we would say in Germany. We have the nice term of Stimmung. Stimmung is basically also mood, but it's also attunement. So
I think we have the same in Danish.
Yeah,
we have the same in Danish. Okay, fine. Yeah. Okay. Then you see the term Stimmung und Verstimmung, as we call, for example, depression. Depression in German can also be called eine Verstimmung, so a disattunement of the lived body. And therapy would consist in a reattunement. So as we deal with an instrument, a musical instrument that is somehow distorted and the sounds are somehow distorted, we have to attune or reattune the instrument. This is a nice picture, I think, a nice metaphor to describe what we try through therapy, namely enable the patient to better be aware of to attune to his own body, so to speak, to his own bodily resonance, to be aware of it, but also to change the way the body reacts to a given situation. And we are, through embodiment research, as we have described in this paper, we are, through embodiment research, now much better informed about all kinds of pre-settings, so to speak, that the body creates vis-a-vis certain situations. If I'm upright and raise my head, I will be in a completely different attunement to my environment than if I'm just slumped and looking down to the floor. We know from embodiment research how much this changes all our activity, our mood, but also the memories, the ideas that come to mind. And embodiment research has found that depressed patients, of course, have a slumped gait, a kind of depressed gait, and this gait already leads in a circular loop to the corresponding depressed mood and the depressive thoughts. All this is a kind of resonant loop where we can try and reattune the body, help the patient be aware of another position, do kind of dance movement therapy with the patient where they try to experience joy through jumping, for example, as we did in our department. And all this reattunes the body, changes the instrument, so to speak, in a certain sense, So this metaphor is not just a metaphor, but can be used in various ways to help the patient overcome his disorder.
I think, at least I can speak for myself, and probably also Eric, we're very intuitively attracted to an approach like this. I can imagine some more dogmatic, I guess, psychiatrists and also psychologists would maybe question the efficacy of it, maybe with regards to empirical research. I don't know if you can kind of summarize the state of empirical research with kind of more embodied therapies like dance therapy, or maybe more music therapy or whatever you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, it depends on how you see the glass. Is it half empty or is it half full? In this case, one has to admit that experiential approaches, body-oriented approaches, what we call co-therapy, and usually in psychiatry, has not had a very good reputation in the discipline, and therefore hasn't been researched into and explored empirically in sufficient ways. One has to admit that. So there are a number of empirical studies, for example, on the impact of body-oriented therapy, for example, body-oriented group therapy on schizophrenic self-disorders, just to take this example, which have found that there is a significant impact of such approaches, which can be compared and which is even to a certain extent superior to pharmacological approaches, because self-disorders, negative symptoms in schizophrenia are something that is more or less outside of pharmacological impact. So when we deal with these chronic and basic states, we can say that there is, in the meantime, a strong empirical evidence for the efficacy of such approaches, which has even led the National Health Service and the National Health Institute in Great Britain to regard experiential body-oriented music therapy and creative approaches to be number one approaches for chronic schizophrenia, because there's just no other effective approach from the biological level. So just to take this one example, points out that there are promising approaches, that there is promising research being done also on body-oriented experiential approaches in depression, for example, but it's far from being able to change the field in a fundamental way, and we have to do much more than has been done so far in the next decades to prove the efficacy of such approaches. That is the current state. I cannot I cannot put it differently, I think.
We had a text in one of our courses that took up this phenomena of the embodied theories through history, and that a lot of it was like grassroots therapies. People came up with a different kind of therapy and tried it off, and it was not very centralized. It was very organic, the movement of the embodied theories. So do you believe that it needs to be more centralized, that you need to have like several few big approaches, or is it a good thing that it's more organic, that there are many different kinds of dance theories or embodied theories?
Yeah, the grassroots phase of a field is a very important phase in order to stimulate creativity, to try out, to induce people to try out all kinds of different possibilities, and thus to in a heuristic sense, to open up the field. But on the other hand, over time, it becomes increasingly important, and in the end, it becomes decisive to integrate the variety of approaches into a couple of major fields, or we could say schools, however you put it, a couple of major centered approaches in order to gain the impact and the power that we need to compete with the biological approaches, because biological approaches, as you know, are supported through billions of euros and dollars, because all the research agencies and all the university departments play together in order to put all the money in this field, no matter whether it produces any significant effect, as we have seen biological approaches to our brains approaches haven't changed our therapy and our diagnosis at all in psychiatry over the last 30 years. There have been thousands of papers, but nothing has changed our basic therapeutic and diagnostic approach to clinical psychiatry in any relevant sense. But that hasn't changed the policy of the research institutes and the research agencies and the university departments, because they are all based on the biological approach that reproduces itself again and again over years and decades. So we have to compete with a strong socio-political impact of this paradigm, which is the leading paradigm. And we can only compete with this impact and with this power when we become powerful ourselves. And that is not possible on a grassroots level, to my view.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe we may be starting to approach the end, but then I'd maybe like to ask you a very difficult and maybe unfair question about, let's say, in like 30 or 50 years, what do you think psychiatry will probably look like, and what would you hope that it will look like?
Probably and hopefully. I'm inclined not to separate these two aspects completely, and I'm inclined to think that they converge more or less, or at least that it's not completely hopeless on the one hand, but on the other hand that it's quite clear that the biological and reductionist approach is still mainstream and will remain mainstream for the next decades. I don't think that this can be changed immediately. But on the other hand, I'm hopeful regarding the increasing spreading of a non-reductive approach in psychiatry, in particular regarding the role of social psychiatry, of ecological approaches. For example, next year, the German National Conference of Psychiatry, which attracts at least 8,000 or 10,000 psychiatrists from the whole country, which is a really big conference. This yearly conference next year has the overall topic and the overall title of ecological psychiatry. Of course, one has to know here that there is a strong impact of digitalized approaches to psychiatry, relying on so-called ecological momentary assessment, namely of the digital tools and smartphones and the data that patients produce through their ongoing digital life, so to speak. And this so-called ecological approach wants to use these data for another, of course, in the end, reductionist approach to mental disorders, which disregards subjective experience and just looks at the data that patients produce. So that is the minus side of this title. But on the other hand, it's quite clear that ecological psychiatry is a term that covers much more and covers a lot of what I have pointed out as important for psychiatry, so that at least we see that on a more general level, which includes psychiatry as a whole, also the hospitals, the psychiatrists in their private practice and so on. So all psychiatry cannot shift to a reductionist approach. So I'm optimistic that psychiatry as a living discipline that deals with patients in their environment needs and will acquire more and more of an ecological thinking and an ecological approach in which the body is crucially included, because the body mediates all these relations. So I'm optimistic that we can work for and achieve over the next decades a more and more non-reductionist take on psychiatry, a more and more non-reductionist paradigm. It won't become the mainstream paradigm, but it will have increasing impact. That is my hope, but also my prediction. So my prediction of the probable development is not disastrous at all.
Well, that's nice to hear.
Good note to approach the end on.
Okay.
I don't know, maybe there are some students or something who listen to this and want to kind of get an introduction into this kind of thinking. Do you have any one paper or chapter or book or something that you would recommend? If
the best, because it's I could point out 2 or 3, but the best would be if I send you these papers and you can distribute them to students and colleagues who are interested in reading more about that.
We can put them in the show notes, so they will be in when you see this podcast. You can just click on the texts. So
okay, that's another possibility. Of course, yeah. Let's do it like this. But thank you very much for these stimulating questions and also for your initiative. I hope it's helpful for your colleagues, for other students in your field, and I'm looking forward to further contacts.
Perfect.
Definitely. And thanks so much for doing this again. We really enjoyed it, I think. And
thank you. You're welcome.
Our listeners will too.